And I'm going to say hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. Grab a coffee, make yourself comfortable for the next 1 hour and a half. We have an exciting conversation about microbiome, and we have experts in the field with, which have participated in launching clinical trials as well as products to the market. And we would like to welcome everybody, and we would like to feel free to ask questions at the end of the webinar about what we discussed today, as well as if you are interested to be a speaker or participate in continuing our conversation about challenges arise in microbiome field. And we would like to start with a little bit about Westchester Biotech project. Today, Joanne, she's the executive director of the Westchester Biotech project. She's not going to join us, and I'm going to try to be Joanne today and talk a little bit about the Westchester Biotech project and what is the mission. And I love the mission of Westchester Biotech project because it brings specialists and multidisciplinary specialists from the field. They bring them together, and they give us the chance to ask questions and foresee problems down the journey of bringing products to the market, and understanding all the multiple pieces involved in a microbiome. And today we will have two speakers, and we will try to debug the microbiome by understanding the clinical landscape and ways to build a successful clinical trial with Eitan Akirav, as well as how to launch a market a successful microbiome product. We'll discuss about 5 major considerations with Regina Au. She is the CEO and a new product new product planning and strategic planning at BioMarketing Insight. For this meeting, Kit Boshian might join us and maybe ask a couple of questions and tell us more about, he is the CEO of the Institute for Life Science Entrepreneurship. And I mentioned about Joanne. She's the co-founder and the executive director of the Westchester Biotech project. And a little bit about the Westchester Biotech project. The Consortium on Translational Research in Microbiome is a community of practice focused on facilitating the implementation of the microbiome research to enhance the drug discovery and development. With us, we have multiple leaders from different fields, which are we bring together a community to discuss about the new challenges in this space. And we get inspired by the problems of the microbiome, because those problems will bring into the same table researchers, data scientists, engineers, and all together will create an infrastructure for developing microbiome products and bring them to the market and bring them more closer to the patient. And I think that's the most important part of our mission and the Westchester Biotech project. We have had the Westchester Biotech project had multiple sponsors and collaborators, and you can see here the list is probably even more extensive than from what you see here. But we are in this exciting journey to bring a microbiome in the 21st century, and because of that, it takes a village for development. Westchester Biotech project is not only about microbiome. They have a couple of divisions, the career consortium division, where everybody understands the need of training and changing the training in this space, which is brings different expertise in the same table. And there is a transition toolkit, and there is a clinical research roundtable, and a career consortium has from another branch, the data analytics hub, which is the part where we involve the microbiome of this development and opportunity, as well as the Blueprint 2030. The Blueprint 2030 is all about the future and what's going to happen in 10 years from now. Future events, the today event, Advancing Microbiome Science to Clinical Practice, which is going to be an essential pain point for microbiome, as well as we have a next event on November 17. It's a breakfast, it's the Thanksgiving, it's coming, and all those events, in a way, they kind of prepare us for the holiday season. And next year, we are planning a conference, and hopefully we will know if it's going to be in person or it's going to be online, but let's keep that for the next year. And let's come back to our discussion today, and let's debug the microbiome, understanding the clinical trial landscape and ways to build a successful clinical trial program with Eitan Akirav, who he is the CEO and the co-founder of Conkai Consulting. And Eitan has 20 plus year experience in academia and industry. He's leveraging a deep understanding of real world aspects of the research and clinical development. And together with his business acumen, he provides a cross-functional bridge across those organizations. And now we give an opportunity to Eitan to debug the microbiome.
Thank you so much, Adela. It is really a pleasure to be here, and I really wanted to thank you for extending the invitation. For full disclosure, I am an immunologist by training, and although in the old days immunology and microbiology were pooled together, I am not the microbiologist. However, I will attempt to give you a view of the type of considerations that are required when one is thinking about bringing the microbiome research to the next level. I spent a good few years in academia, including being an adjunct professor at Stony Brook University at NYU, as well as running my own lab for about 7 years, and then moved into industry. So that really allowed me to look at kind of a bird's eye view at all the pieces that should be considered when basic research is conducted as you're trying to bring it up to clinical applications. Okay, so before I start, I have no conflict of interest to disclose. I wanted to kind of highlight the 3 main key points of the talk today and kind of understand what does it really mean to go through a clinical development plan. And the first point to remember is that whenever one is thinking about any type of therapeutic modalities, it is important to look at it from a longitudinal point of view. You can't look at a specific time point or a specific time snap and then think that this would address all of your needs in the future. So there should be some sort of a holistic view. Besides the immediately obvious issues of intellectual property and regulatory considerations, which to some level are discussed at the academic institution, there is also a significant need for clinical planning. And this is how to think about bringing a new therapeutic into the market. And I'm going to touch upon this during the talk today. And finally, if anyone's hoping to bring a new therapeutic to market, of course, it requires both regulatory approval, but also money. And having sufficient preclinical data, standardized drug production and manufacturing, and a viable clinical trial design really can make all the difference. All right, so I borrowed this slide from Taconic. I thought that it was a very nice summary of the pathway for drug discovery. The only thing I would take out of this, or the only 2 things I would take out of this, is that this is a multi-year effort. It takes approximately 7 to 10 years to bring a drug to market, which means that the strategic horizon of anyone who's planning on doing so should take into account a pretty long run. The second part is the amount of money that's required. It is normally estimated in the billions to get a drug to market. But in this case, I would argue that the approach should be a piecemeal approach. You shouldn't plan on raising $1 billion ahead of the time, and it's kind of a milestone-driven type of a process. All right, so you've done a research, or maybe you're an investor, or maybe you're somebody who's just generally interested in the area of microbiome, and you actually identified a new intervention, and you have data, or you yourself actually ran some initial testing. Now comes the question on what to do next. And as I alluded to before, the right type of model to establish the clinical efficacy of your new intervention can be roughly broken into these 3 points that I'm delineating on the slide. One of them is looking at cell-based models. In the microbiome field, because the intervention is obviously using live prokaryote cells, it is important to look at the cell-based and how it relates to the specific human disease. And I will give a specific example down the road. Animal studies, there is a lot of debate on what's really the best animal study, animal model in order to use for animal studies. Gnotobiotic mouse models where there is fecal matter transplantation and recolonization of, for example, mice guts provide one model. But these all have to be taken with a grain of salt, and remembering that as reliable as animal studies are, they do not provide a full representation of the human state. And finally, and this is a kink in the microbiome world, we know that a lot of the interventions that are being sought after today actually use fecal or stool donors. And this really is the starting material in order to reconstitute and colonize a recipient. And in this case, it's really important to look at the definition of what is a normal donor. So on that last point, I thought it would be really important to spend a couple more seconds and kind of discuss what exactly it means when one is actually looking at the donors. So in gnotobiotic models, a lot of the times people will try and use to do colonization using stools from diseased individuals as well as from individuals that are otherwise considered to be healthy. But because this is such a wild card, right? Each person is different. There are some factors which, when designing the experiment, should be really, as possibly, tightly controlled, especially when talking about small numbers of animals. Many of the studies will include a couple of animals, maybe 2 or 3 dozen animals in a study. So it's very important to get a good grip on the fecal matter transfer donors, which would include where are they coming from, geographical location, ethnicity, gender, metabolic view, such as BMI and age, and very importantly, past or recent treatment with antibiotics, because we know that antibiotics will have a profound effect on the gut flora in these individuals. And the second part is to think about it from more of a long-term point of view. If you become too restrictive on the criteria that you're choosing for these donors, even in these preclinical trials, it may actually impede your ability to find relevant donors and perform data relevant experiments and recruitment. So that is, I believe, is quite unique to the microbiome field today. So the second part is, again, an added challenge in the microbiome. In the old school development of clinical drugs, such as therapeutics, including small molecules, even biologics, there is normally a relatively straightforward plan for assessing the drug effect, including PK/PD and therapy mode of action, which falls under PD. But I think in the case of microbiome, because we are looking at things that happen relatively in a black box, these bacteria work on certain elements that we hope will change the overall welfare of the patient, we really have to be able to come up with a list of biomarkers that will be clinically relevant and accepted by the FDA as a good measure of clinical outcome. I give here an example of effect of microbiome in metabolic point of view. There's a lot of literature on using microbiome to improve diabetes, NASH, and so on. And if one is going that route or those indications, it's important to adhere to the general biomarkers that are used for any type of therapy that would target these conditions. The second part has to do with PK/PD. In the case of introducing new bacteria, there is really no half-life or decay in a classic manner where the liver processes a certain drug and then reduces it. So we have to come up with a way to look at ways to quantify the efficacy and the distribution of the new microbiome that was introduced, or the new type of bacteria, as well as looking at where those bacteria make a difference. That would be the PD. How is the drug, in this case, it's not a drug, it's a prokaryote that we're looking at. How is that prokaryote actually makes a difference when it comes to the patient? Okay, and finally, and I think I'm the one to admit blame to this first and foremost. When you start research, you really don't think about how this is going to end up in the clinic. But having spent a few years in industry, there are key questions that are going to be critical on whether whatever you're working on is going to be successful or not, right? For example, how is the drug going to be delivered? Are you going to be looking at giving the microbes in an oral, or are you going to have to give some sort of a drug to manipulate them in the gut? What is the stability? Does it require refrigeration, or can it be done in room temperature? We all remember the Moderna versus Pfizer versus J&J stability for vaccine. And I think that's true for any type of therapeutic that we're looking at. And how can we ensure that the microbiome therapy that we have actually is safe, is pathogen-free, and is really depleted of any type of fecal debris contamination? Because as I mentioned, a lot of the material we have is FMT. It is fecal matter transfer. And finally, can we scale it up? Can we produce a lot of these microbes in a specific setup? Can we ensure lot-to-lot consistency? Think about using different donors, right? That's going to have a serious effect on the type of consistency that will be required. And all of these questions, particularly the last question, is going to be something that the FDA is going to be extremely interested in as they're thinking about approving a therapy. So I strongly believe in learning through case studies. So I decided to cover here a company which got a lot of press in the past decade or two, and their name is actually Cerba Therapeutics. I have no conflict of interest with the company. I don't hold their share, but I thought that their story is actually quite interesting, generally speaking. So a little bit about the company. This is kind of I would say, a commercial and business snapshot. They've been around since 2010. So this company has almost 12 years under their belt, HQ'd in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They are publicly traded, which adds to the financial stability, and also with a $1 billion market cap. They have a very nice list of collaborators that they work with, including Nestle Healthcare and MSKCC, Memorial Sloan. They seem to have a very solid management team, which has a good synthesis of business and science SMEs that are able to drive the company forward. But most importantly, they have gotten a lot of press last year in 2020 as being the first company to receive FDA approval for a microbiome-based therapy. And I think that is one of the reasons I wanted to show that this as a case study. So looking at the pipeline, aside from the SR 109, which I'm actually going to go into detail soon, they do have a pipeline that's quite robust, and they're trying to target anything from oncology to infections to GI tract diseases such as ulcerative colitis. And I think that is, to me, a great sign of the potential of microbiome, right? It can actually be quite impactful in different type of indications. So I will go very quickly through how the company thinks about the microbiome process, and hopefully you can appreciate the advantages of this very structured 5-step model that they have used. So they have a platform that allows them to do some discovery, development, production, and then testing of their microbiome candidates. And the first step that they do is really involved in microbiome discovery. They do a lot of legwork before actually starting to work, looking at data mining of microbiome flora from different patient cohorts. I think if you read on their website, they use publicly available consortia. And I think having this group would be critical, right? As data is being deposited and we understand more and more about the different flora of the bacteria in different diseases and indications. They then go into great length in pairing the microbiome together with genomic and metabolic data of the bugs that they're putting it, but also of the tissues that are going to be affected by a specific disease. Again, they mine a lot of publicly available data in order to do that. And finally, they are trying to create through their own patient cohort an understanding, a kinetic understanding of the changes of the microbiome in the patients versus controls during disease progression. So this is very important as they're trying to model the deficiency in the microbiome and where would their therapy actually make a difference. Once they've established that, they create what they call a bacteria consortia design, which is technically thinking about a unique mix. All of those are commensal bacteria, which are otherwise harmless to humans. And then they undergo some in silico computer modeling in order to understand how these bacteria and their byproducts could actually interact with human cells, disease pathways, and other relevant metabolites. Once they've zoomed on a specific consortia of bugs, they actually look and see whether they can see these bacteria behave the way that they expected in vitro and disease relevant animal models. For in vitro, they use human cell assays. I also found it interesting that they mentioned using organoids. Organoids are becoming a gold standard because they provide 3D modeling versus a single layer cell. And I think that's very clever of them to target specific tissue organoids and see how they will interact with the bacteria byproducts. And finally, and I clumped step 4 and 5 together, they give a lot of attention to manufacturing. So the first thing that they tackled, and I think put them above the crowd, was to adhere to current good manufacturing practice, which is both includes quality control and quality assurance steps. They have reported a proprietary process, that provides them an ability to neutralize any type of associated pathogens that could come from donors that actually donate stool, as well as removing fecal matter. What I liked about it more is that they actually adjusted very nicely to the COVID situation and provided a very strong emphasis in making sure that no unwanted viruses or bacteria that could be pathogenic are present within their preps. So what did they actually tackle with this FDA-approved therapy? And just because of the interest of time, I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. They were looking at C. diff infections, looking at the fact that almost 60% of all patients that present with C. diff actually had prior infection in the past. They also acknowledge from the literature that using antibiotics, as you would expect, reduces bacterial diversity. And then those good bugs that are supposed to recolonize the intestine don't do it very efficiently, giving the C. diff an opportunity to grow again. Firmicutes are required for the protection against CDI, which is C. diff infection recurrence. And that's also from papers. And the mechanism of action that they've identified is the conversion of primary bile acid into secondary bile acid products. And those secondary bile acid products actually inhibit the growth of C. diff within the intestine. So you can see how nicely they actually found a deficiency, found the mechanism that allows C. diff to grow, and then found a cohort, a consortia of bacteria that could help with converting bile acid from primary to secondary. And their solution, as I mentioned, looking at previous studies published of FMT in the literature, is that the subclass of firmicutes are actually associated with C. diff resolution, and that if they are able to get a prep that's pathogen-free, fecal debris-free, and includes the actual spores, they would be able to deliver it. I thought that the brilliance of their approach was that they actually decided to go with bacteria spores, which can survive the gastric very low pH, which actually meant that they had a path of easy delivery through oral administration. Again, looking forward to how you would actually deliver it to the patients. So just kind of a very brief review of the study. They had approximately 90 subjects altogether, 89, and they have done a very strong characterization on history of using antibiotics, the type of qualification of the presence of C. diff, and I'll talk about it in a second. That was almost their demise back in 2016, and whether they were using PPIs to alter the acidity level in the gut. They did have several episodes of adverse effects. And I'm going to be honest with you, I didn't expect so many adverse effects from a therapy that includes introduction of bacteria to the gut, because we know that the gut is, generally speaking, considered to be an external protected environment compared to the internal body. But this was delivered per os, orally, and actually makes sense. They had one casualty. That person actually died, I believe, from lung cancer, which was completely unrelated to the treatment. But overall, they saw no big differences between the placebo and the treated group, rendering the treatment overall safe. Okay, then came the real bummer. They were doing their analysis, looking at the effect. And in fact, they got absolutely non-statistically significant effect in the group that received in blue versus the placebo in gray in terms of recurrence. But being good scientists, they decided to go back and look at the data and break it based on age. And what they actually saw is that people of age 65 and older were the main beneficiaries of the bacteria. And when you come to think about it, it's not really surprising, right? When you look at Parkinson's disease and other neurodegenerative disease in older individuals, you know that the gut bacteria is negatively affected as you get older. So it kind of makes sense from a mechanistic point of view when you look at that. They also were quite clever at looking at levels of pharmacodynamics and pharmacokinetics. Again, it's very hard to measure levels of these bacteria, but they ended up doing a good job at looking at species diversity in the fecal matter. They use sequencing, gunshot sequencing, as well as colony forming unit testing in order to see exactly what type of bacteria. And not surprisingly, they saw that people who received their consortia of bacteria, the cocktail of bacteria, had a higher diversity overall of different species, which, as I mentioned before, was associated with a better clinical outcome. And the last point, which they did, was looking at exploratory endpoints, which is to look at what happens to the bile acid, tying everything together back to what could be the beneficiary effect of this subset of commensal bacteria. And what they could see is that the higher the number of Cerba 109 bacteria species that were able to colonize, the better was the conversion of primary bile acids into secondary bile acids. And to remind you, that conversion keeps C. diff at bay. So that's yet another correlation, a nice correlation between that and clinical outcome. So to wrap it all together and to kind of look at what made them as a success, maybe looking at it as a roadmap. First of all, what they did is they created Cell 109 with a direct comparison to true fecal suspensions. That removed away the need for the worry for pathogens and fecal matter, right? You now know what your prep is and you can produce it in a reliable manner. They immediately went into good manufacturing practice, CGMP, and to ensure that the API or their active pharmaceutical ingredient actually is good and can be reproducible. They have been doing screening of the stool of both donors and rescreening to make sure that the patients are not getting any type of pathogens that they should be doing. They chose the gastric resistant spores of those CER109 bacteria for oral delivery, critical to give it in a pill, sorry. And they looked at very solid biomarker plans. Where are the bacteria? What's the effect on the bile? And whether they can detect the actual C. diff at the end. And as I mentioned, the bile acid concentration provided a great mechanism overall. But there's always a kink, and things are never what they seem. And as I alluded to, in 2016, they were actually, this trial, this phase 2 trial, was actually declared as a colossal failure. The title of the article was that the failure of the phase 2 delivered a blow to the gut of the microbiome research. And I think the reason I'm bringing it up is because what ended up happening is that they relied on PCR as a biomarker, which when they went back to check, saw that PCR was overly estimated the number of C. diff in their stools. So they went over and resorted to an ELISA-based C. diff toxin analysis. Now, the details don't matter, but what matters is that this really highlights the complexity of looking at secondary metabolites and pathogen when it comes to microbiome. And kudos to them for actually pushing forward, reviving the discussion with the FDA, launching the phase 3, and then ultimately getting it approved. So I wanted to thank everybody for the time. Special for today is Veterans Days, and I kind of remember it first thing in the morning, and I think they do deserve a special thank. They are the reasons we can have these meetings, and that's pretty much it. Thank you, Adela. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Eitan. Thank you for this great presentation and telling us about Cerba's therapeutic experience and all the challenges when you design a clinical trials, and how important it is to pay attention to the secondary biomarkers. And we are in an uncharted territory. We are, because of that, is the need to have a multidisciplinary approach and have specialists for multiple facets to understand better when you design a clinical trials, and to understand better how to tie together and maybe create ways to design biomarkers, and also maybe just in a way initiate a discussion about the challenges for the regulatory part and create a template which is specific for microbiome, because microbiome in my mind is going to open the personalized medicine, the true personalized medicine era, and it's going to be in probably as a test when we go to hospitals, and when we go to for any disease we have, we're going to have a pre-screening of microbiome. And I think in order to have that, in order to have this opportunity, we need to have in a way like or easy way to understand those biomarkers, or to in order to be able to create the test, because in a way microbiome is very complex and contain many pieces. We can have microbiome as a diagnostic tool as well as a therapeutic, and in this case Cerba is one of those companies, in my mind, very brave. They are truly going in uncharted territory. And the traditional way to investigate a drug, it's very linear in a way. But this is, like you mentioned, it's a black box. And you just either, what I like something you mentioned so much, the age of patients. That's really important, because that the way we're gonna give therapeutics regarding the microbiome is gonna be age related, because in a way, our immune system will keep a tally of all of our disease. And in my mind, microbiome and immune system, they are together, and it's kind of a balance, and all together will influence the way we, is going to be a successful clinical trial or a failure. But thank you so much. And we're going to go to continue our discussion on to Regina. And we're going to bring all these challenges in the next step. And the next step, Regina Au, she is the CEO and the new product planning and the strategic planning at the BioMarketing Insight. She's going to talk about how to launch and how to market a successful microbiome product. And she has in mind 5 major considerations. And a little bit about Regina. She has 20 plus experience in the biotechnology and the pharmaceutical and medical device and diagnostics and in healthcare industry. She has expertise in numerous therapeutic areas in cardiology, infectious disease, immunology, oncology. She had published articles in numerous journals. She has spoken at international conferences, as well as she has her company has a newsletter, and I enjoy reading every month the newsletter. And now we're gonna give a chance, Regina, to challenge our discussion about what are the next challenges in microbiome, the market, and address market. Regina.
Thank you, Adela, for that kind introduction. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me here today, and particularly Adela. As Adela said, my presentation is 5 major factors to consider in launching and marketing successful, microbiome product. Getting a little hoarse. I'm kind of getting over a cold, so you'll excuse my hoarseness. So in terms of this presentation, this is the agenda, and we're going to talk about the microbiome market, the FDA classification of microbiome, the 5 major considerations, which include regulatory, reimbursement, marketing, building value early in product development, and why it's important to consider a commercial strategy earlier. So Eitan talked about the R&D part of it, and most people think that marketing or the business part of it comes at the end, like when you're ready to launch a product. And we have found, and this is, having worked in big companies like Merck and Genzyme, that if you want a successful product, you're going to have to start thinking about the commercial aspects of it early in product development, because the marketing or business people actually will define what the target product profile, but from a business and marketing point of view. So Eitan talked about what is the product going to look like, but it's coming from an R&D point of view. And the marketing people will say it has to be, looks like this in order to be able to compete in the market. And a lot boils down to compliance in terms of the patients, what is going to meet the needs of all your stakeholders, which I will go into a little more detail. And so in order to do that, you have to start early. So it's thinking about what is your end product going to look like, and then working your way back. Because if you don't, you may you may develop a product that maybe people feel like they don't need, or you might not be able to compete in the market because you haven't looked at what the market will dictate. So with that, I just wanted to say everyone's very enthused about the microbiome market because it's huge. The US market is approximately 300 million, which is going to grow in terms of to 900 in 2022 to 2025 respectively. And the global market in 2017 was $1.18 billion, and they're predicting it's going to grow to over 2.7 billion by 2023, with a compound annual growth rate about 20%, which is very attractive to companies that want to get into this market. However, there's a caveat to that. Here's a list of microbiome companies. You can see everyone's trying to get into the microbiome space. And this list is actually old by now because there's been a number of companies that have actually entered the market since then. So the reason I say that marketing comes in very early is because we have to look at the FDA classification, because marketing looks at everything. And so with the FDA classification, it is microbiome is classified under the live biotherapeutic products, or LBP, which is live organisms. And it's further divided into conventional foods, dietary supplements and nutraceuticals, and drugs. And so the company has to decide which path they want to take in this, but you can't just decide on the FDA classification alone. You have to take in consideration how you're going to market the product. And I'll get into a little bit more detail as I go along. So with conventional foods, we think about yogurt, fermented foods, and these are all the things that are classified under conventional foods. Now, if you take most people as they're doing their R&D development, they probably want to take the least resistant FDA or the most simplest FDA in terms of classification, because then you don't have to have trials, et cetera, et cetera. Well, there's pros and cons to doing that. And the pros are that in terms of regulatory, it's easier than getting approval for a drug. Reimbursement, not so much reimbursement, but the cost is low because you're having foods that you eat every day. But when you're marketing, you have to consider how you're going to market the product. And so with the B2C, which is business to consumer, you're selling directly to the consumer, which is good. There's no prescription, which of course is an advantage. There's a low barrier to market, which has an advantage and disadvantage. And it's faster to market this foods rather than drugs. However, as they say, there's always two sides to a coin. And so the cons are, in terms of regulatory, you can't make any claims, which makes it really hard to say your product will, and in terms of a therapeutic, is going to help you in terms of treatment, et cetera. There is no reimbursement, obviously, for foods. And as far as marketing is concerned, you're talking about mass marketing to everyone, which can get very expensive. It's very hard to build awareness because, again, all these foods are out there. Everyone is saying the same thing. How do you distinguish yourself from the other products in terms of what the benefits of your food will be? It will be hard to educate the consumer because, again, you're getting a little bit into the technical things, which consumers may or may not be knowledgeable about it. And then, of course, if you're selling, say, yogurt and the benefits of yogurt, you have, consumers that are lactose intolerant or don't like dairy products. So that's an issue you have to look out for. And some of them don't like fermented foods. So again, how do you market your product where you're trying to get the most people to buy your product? And a con is low barrier to market, which I said was a plus because it's very easy to get in. However, because it's very easy to get in, everybody can get in. And so how do you distinguish yourself and what is the advantage of yours over the others when you're doing mass marketing? You're trying to build awareness, which is really hard, and it's hard to educate the consumer. So again, you have to think about both things. You can't just think, oh, I'll just go the easy route, regulatory. And, reimbursement seems like, there's no reimbursement, but foods aren't, that expensive, but it can be depending on how much you need to get the effect that you want to sort of not claim, but say that it may have benefits. So it's all on the indication or your wording. So I show this in terms of some people will think, okay, let's do it under dietary supplements and nutraceutical. And I picked this picture because as you go into any type of pharmacy, you will see rows and rows of dietary supplements and nutraceuticals. Your consumer may or may not know the difference between supplements and nutraceuticals. And again, it's a huge range and you're looking at all this and you go, I have no idea which one to choose. So it makes it hard to market it. So what are the pros? Well, there are several ways you could do this. And the first one is business to consumer. The pros, of course, in terms of regulatory, it's a lot easier than a drug. And as far as reimbursement, there is no reimbursement. So it is a pro, but it's at a con at the same time. And as far as marketing, you have to, in terms of business to consumer, it's a pro because you're selling directly to the consumer. There's no prescription that the doctor has to write, and it's a low barrier to market. However, the flip side, because there's always a flip side, the regulatory, since it's not a drug, you can't make any claims to say your product will work and it does this. You can sort of hint at it. Reimbursement, since there's no reimbursement, these nutraceuticals can get very, very expensive. I don't know if anybody has gotten any supplements or nutraceuticals, but they can run pretty much as costly sometimes as a drug, particularly if it's a generic drug. Marketing, you have mass marketing, which again, business to consumer, you have to do it by TV or regular print ads, which can get very expensive. And just like foods, it's hard to build awareness. It's hard to educate the consumer. Competition is fierce, as you can see with this particular picture. There's a sea of supplements and nutraceuticals, and this is only a small snapshot. There's usually aisles in respect to supplements and nutraceuticals. Competition is fierce. And if you're a consumer, you're going to say, I have no idea which one's better. You may look at price, but most consumers will be just very confused and say, I don't even know which way to go. You're fighting for shelf space, which when you have it stocked, it gets, anything that's eye level, of course, with the pharmacy is more expensive than if you're at the bottom, because where people can't see. It's a low barrier to market, as I mentioned before. It's a pro in a sense that anybody can get in, but the fact that everyone can get in makes competition fierce. Another way to look at it in terms of dietary supplement is consumer to consumer. So the pros, again, as I mentioned, in terms of easier than a drug, there is no real reimbursement. And as far as marketing from consumer to consumer, the consumer is selling to other consumers, which is sort of like a Amway type where, a representative for the company will start selling, to other consumers. The consumer has to educate the other consumers, which can get tricky depending on the training program for that. Most of the times, it's usually the consumer selling to family and friends and colleagues, which kind of gets limited as opposed to, more than your family, friends, and colleagues. There's no prescription, obviously, and there's a low barrier to market. The flip side on this is that, again, you can't make any claims. There's no reimbursement. Supplements can get very expensive. And as far as marketing, you need to hire salespeople, obviously, in terms of the consumer to consumer. You need data to support it, because now you're getting, in terms of a consumer to consumer, you're going to have consumers who are going to ask a lot of questions. And so what data do you have to support it? Which means you're going to have to produce that data. So you're going to have to do something to say that, what you're claiming, or not claiming, but what you're suggesting that your product is doing, that you have data to back it up. And again, competition is fierce, and with the low barrier to market, a lot of people can get in, which is why competition is fierce. And then you have one more category. So, if you think this is easy, it's not. Just like in terms of product development, from the drug side, from the R&D side, it can get very complicated. Well, it can get very complicated on the marketing or business side. And there's a lot of things that you need to consider. So for the B2B, which is business to business, again, the regulatory and the reimbursement is the same. But when it comes to marketing, now you're talking about targeting. So you're selling to physicians now. And the physicians are the ones who are going to sell your product in the market because they're going to recommend it to their patients. So the physicians have to educate the patient, which means you're going to need good data. And of course, there's no prescription, or in this case. From the cons, again, regulatory is the same, but as far as the marketing, you're going to need to hire medical sales representative as opposed to a sales representative. And the reason you're going to have to hire a medical sales representative is because you want the sales representative to be credible. And so they're going to have to talk at the level of a physician. It's hard to see physicians If anyone has tried to do that, especially now with the pandemic, where they may or may not be in the office and everything's virtual. Some physicians don't believe in supplements. And again, you're going to need data to support that, because the physicians, in order for them to recommend your product, is going to want data to make sure that this is going to help their patients. And competition is fierce because, again, not only the dietary and nutraceutical representatives are out there, but you also have the drug representatives out there. So now you're competing with the drug representatives. And now more and more physicians are not seeing anybody, whether it's a drug representative or a dietary supplement nutraceutical representative. So the next category is drugs. And the reason I have a question mark is here, as you heard Eitan talked this morning in his presentation, that even though Sierra's got their approval, there's some hiccups in terms of their data and what they can really claim. The claim was more broad, now it's more narrow. And so the jury is not out in terms of exactly how these drugs are benefited. We're still learning, because this is, even though this field has been around for decades, it's still new in terms of how it helps patient. And I think C. diff is an easy one, only because of the fact that, with the fecal transplant, you have data in terms of to sort of compare it to. And so that helps. But for the other, in terms of diseases, that is all new. And what Eitan was talking about diversity, it's becoming more apparent that in terms of the more diverse microbiome you have, it is more beneficial, because now you have, think about it as like a company or an academia. You have all these different departments, right? And the company or the academia institution can't really run successfully or well without each department. And so the diversity of your microbiome is those departments, because they all play a role in terms of your health. And if you have, if your departments are not there, working efficiently and helping out in terms of, whatever goals you have, it's not going to be run well. And so when you look at in terms of the various diseases, they all have signatures, right? So there's a dominance in one species, but then there's an absence, and that's where you start to have diseases. And so it's really important to look at the biomarkers, which Eitan had mentioned, but also to look at it more from a higher view in terms of what's needed. And that seems to be, what I had just mentioned to be very, very important. Biomarkers are very important, but to look at the diversity, because you want all your departments running, functioning well. So with drugs, which is business to business, the pros are that in terms of regulatory, now you have an indication or a claim, but it's a higher barrier to market. With reimbursement, sometimes you may have coverage in terms of the insurance, and therefore the patient will have a small copay, which is always helpful in terms of compliance when it comes to reimbursement with your patient, because if they have to pay a lot out of pocket, they probably are not going to fill the prescription. In marketing for B2B, business to business, you're selling directly to the physician. And so again, anything that's B2B, physician needs to be educated. He needs to educate the patient. He's going to write the prescription. But again, for him to write that prescription, you got to have data to back up your indication. The cons are, obviously, it's a harder path and it needs approval. You have to run clinical trials, which gets very costly, like any drug. Reimbursement, there's some insurance companies that may not cover, and therefore the patient has to pay out of pocket. And when that happens, it gets very costly. From a marketing perspective and how you're going to market the product, you need to hire sales representatives like you do with any other drug. And again, it's hard to see physicians. You need to educate the physician if they're not fully aware in terms of the benefits of a microbiome product. even though it is FDA approved and sort of classified as a drug in their mind until they're educated, it's still going to be, like a supplement. So product superiority is key. So why should they use your particular product over, say, a drug that's already on the market? And competition is going to be fierce depending on what disease you're looking at. Certain diseases are going to be more fierce than others depending on what's available in terms of treatment. So I talk about building commercial value early in product development. And I just wanted to mention, I know commercial is used in a lot of different departments. So when I say commercial, I'm not talking about an R&D definition of commercial. I'm talking about a marketing definition of commercial. And what I mean by that is this chart here. So where does marketing come in? Hence my focus on new product planning is very early in product development. So as you can see, there's disease strategy, candidate nomination, preclinical, then you have your clinical trials, proof of concept in terms of phase 2, development of launch plans. And most people think that marketing only comes in here after the product has been developed. And as I mentioned before, marketing comes in as early as preclinical. As soon as you have a lead candidate, that TPP is defined by both the R&D TPP, which is the technical aspects of it, but then the commercial or marketing comes in, particularly in terms of compliance. So Eitan mentioned, should it be oral or should it be injection? Now, there's pros and cons in terms of from an R&D perspective and from a marketing perspective. Obviously, oral is a lot easier to take for compliance. But in injection, you get to the site where, and it probably metabolizes more, not metabolized, but I'm talking about drug here. You can get to it in terms of into the system a lot quicker. So from an R&D perspective, you may think, okay, maybe I'll do it in injection or an IV, depending on what it is. But from a marketing perspective, if you want your patient to take it, it's an oral drug. But there's a lot of other things in addition to that. And I think the pandemic is a good representative of things you need to think about. So when you think about the vaccine that we had, there were a lot of issues in terms of storage. There were issues in terms of how many dosages, because again, people don't like to take shots. With the vaccine, it's a little bit different because generally the second shot is more painful than, in terms of side effects, it's more painful or have side effects than the first. But all those things you need to consider. And as you can see, there were a lot of barriers in terms of getting people to take the vaccine, including long-term effects. And so that's another issue you're going to have to think about in terms of the microbiome. What is the long-term effect? Even though a lot of the data has been in terms of more short-term, but that's something to think about as well. So again, we come in really early. What is the value proposition there? Because what we want to do is, again, think about all the things that I just mentioned in terms of what is this product going to need to look like to be able to compete in the market. So if you don't do it early, you may develop a product where it can't compete. And that's the last thing you want to do, because it's going to take R&D in terms of development of a drug takes so long to do that you don't want to put all that money in and all that time in to find out that you can't compete in the market or people are not going to use it. And we also come in terms of regulatory, which I just mentioned in terms of the pros and cons. The clinical development plans, because you have to think about reimbursement. So if you think about reimbursement, the payers are going to say, well, why should I use your product? And you say, oh, we do this, because of, whatever reason is. And the next thing they're going to say is, well, show me the data that says that the patient's going to be better off, they're going to recover faster, et cetera. And the only way you can do that is to have data in your clinical trials. It's not going to be your primary and secondary endpoints, but it needs to be in there so that you can show the payers why it's advantageous to use your particular product. And of course, if the payers and all the stakeholders are in favor, then you have what we call market access, or the product is going to be available to the patient. And anybody who you don't meet in terms of their needs, in terms of stakeholders, the product is not going to be available. And again, so all these things are thought about early in product development, so you can make changes if the market should change or something should change, rather than trying to scramble and think about, okay, what are we going to do now? And so I always say that, we do a lot of the upfront work here, to sort of get you going, but that doesn't mean that you don't revisit it. Because again, if it takes 10 to 15 years for the product to come to market, or however long it is, you have to sort of touch bases. Is my hypothesis still valid? And if it's not, then you're going to have to make changes. But getting all these things in, particularly for the clinical trial, if you don't do it for your clinical trials, then you have no data, which means you're not going to get it reimbursed by insurance companies, which means you're going to have to wait until you produce that data, which may take a long time. And all that, time that you got approval and that physicians could use it, you're not getting any revenue from that. So that is, again, why we need to start early. And to take a closer look in terms of defining the target product profile, these are the things that marketing will do in respect to defining what that product should look like to be able to compete in the market and be successful. And I won't go into detail regarding that, but these are all the things that we look at. So why is it important to consider, excuse me, commercial strategy early? And when I mean commercial, I mean marketing, as opposed to the R&D definition, which looks at more the life cycle. Not to say that marketing doesn't look at the life cycle management, but we have different strategies depending on where the product is on a life cycle management. So if one decides, the first point is if one decides the regulatory first, as I showed you before, it dictates the commercial strategy. If one decides the commercial strategy first, it dictates what your regulatory strategy is. So therefore, you need to coordinate in deciding the best option for both strategies based on the company's goals, expertise, and feasibility. You must also align one's reimbursement cost strategy with commercial/marketing strategy, because again, you need data. The payers are not going to reimburse unless you have proof that it's going to be better than what's on the market right now. Going on, each commercial option has its benefits and challenges, as I went over, because again, if you choose one of the earlier ones in terms of, say, nutraceuticals or supplements, you have B2B, you have B2C, you have C2C, which again, they're all very different, and there's a lot of things to consider depending on which one you do. They all have pros and cons. So each option has a different approach and strategy, and and it also uses different marketing tools and sales channels. So everyone thought marketing was easy, but it's not. They all require demonstrating differentiation and superiority. So how do you do that with, say, a conventional food when no one really sees a difference, as opposed to, say, a drug where you have more data because you have clinical trials? All options require significant marketing budget, because remember I mentioned mass marketing or hiring salespeople to build awareness, educate, because this is still a new field for a lot of physicians, and a lot of them are a little weary about it, and to convince that your product is better. They all require early planning. I can't emphasize that enough, which is why in terms of my specialization in new product planning and coming in very early, I can't stress that enough. And if you look at all the bigger companies, this is exactly what they're doing, because that's where I came from, was a big company. And if you don't do it early, you're not going to get your product out there on time, or if you get your product out there, it may not be to the expectations, and you may have to make really, really hard decisions in terms of whether you want to go back or move forward. And so I just wanted to tell this one quick story, because I was talking to someone and I mentioned new product planning, and they thought I was crazy because everyone thinks that marketing comes at the end. And he says, well, you don't know if the product works. And I go, nobody knows whether the product's going to work. I mean, you can have a great phase 2 and fail in phase 3, right? And he says, so why should I do marketing? And I said, okay, so you want to know if the product works, which is phase 2, which is proof of concept. And you get to proof of concept and you find that, yeah, the product works. But then you have a product, which if you didn't do the evaluation in terms of how you're going to market it, or the business part of it, which is the things that I just mentioned prior, you may have a product that people don't want, or it may not be, in terms of compliance, it's not compliant. So now you have a really, really tough decision to make. Either way you go, no one's going to be happy, because you can go back and start from the beginning, because now your product is X and you need Y. And people are not going to be happy because you just spent all that money and all that time, and now you have to redo everything. Not to mention you have to refile with FDA. And you're not going to meet your milestones. Or you can move forward, but if you move forward, that means what you forecast for your product is going to be significantly less, which no one's going to be happy with, because management has already allocated what you have projected in terms of your forecasts, has already been allocated in the 3 to 5 year planning. And so all that money that they had allocated for the future planning is no longer there. So now they're going to have to scramble and find out where we're going to get the money, or can we have that program, etc. And when your product is launched, again, you're going to have a lot lower sales, which no one's going to be happy. So you don't really want to get into that situation where you have to make that tough decision, because whatever decision you make, no one's going to be happy. So if you do it early, you can at least de-risk the product development process in terms of to the best, obviously to the best you can. I mean, there's always things like the pandemic that nobody ever expected. But that's not because there was poor planning or you didn't plan for it. Nobody planned for the pandemic. So in conclusion, I like to say FDA strategy and marketing commercial strategy needs to be aligned. So they both have to, again, it's collaboration between the two. And marketing runs parallel in new product planning to R&D. So everyone thinks about, here's about speed to market, which is true. You want to get your product out to market as soon as possible. And sometimes we tend to pick the most simplest regulatory strategy, but is it the best? So as I explained before, each one has their pros and cons. And the most simpler one, which is the food, conventional food, may not always be the best, because again, low barrier to entry, a lot of people in there. How do you differentiate yourself? How do you show superiority? You can't claim anything. And then what are the repercussions for each marketing commercial strategy? Because, I had pros and cons. So how do you plan for it, that if it's a con, what is your strategy to minimize it or to negate it? Oops, not moving. So your reimbursement strategy needs to be aligned with your FDA and commercial marketing commercial strategy. As I mentioned before, reimbursement wants data. So you need, again, the business marketing hat to say, don't forget about, we need to have this in terms of your, if you're doing the clinical trials, or, think about reimbursement. How is marketing going to, again, using marketing twice, but how are you going to market the product if there is no reimbursement? That's can get really, really tricky. And to do all of this, you need a deep understanding of the market and your customers. You need a deep understanding of the different business models and what each entails. And the last point I want to make is that you need to start planning your strategies from the beginning in product development, as early as target product profile, and sometimes even further, because sometimes, for drugs and not so much, and also the microbiome, you had seen that they had used it like a platform technology. So again, you can't, most companies don't have enough R&D dollars to focus on all the therapeutic areas. So then you need to know which are therapeutic area has the best market potential for your product based on what that product is going to look like. And this way you can prioritize in terms of therapeutic area that you want to focus on. So marketing plays a huge role in a lot of decisions in terms of product development on the R&D side. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. And this is my contact information, should you have any questions later on. And I guess with that, if anybody has any questions.